Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guests for this series are Nduka Otonio and Peter Midgley. Nduka is Associate Professor and Graduate Program Coordinator at the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario. He's also an author and co-editor of 8 books on creative writing and academic research. But we'll be talking with him about his latest collection of poetry, his third, called DisPlace, which was published in October 2021 by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Peter Midgley is an independent scholar, writer, and editor who worked with Nduka on DisPlace. This 4-part series is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Nduka's poetry deals with the politics of language, ideas of place, the diaspora, and the colonization of knowledge. His poetry is conversational, spiritual, and performative. If you closely consider the title, DisPlace, you'll notice the pidgin pronunciation of this place, but also displace, and the simultaneous feelings of belonging and detachment, where you are now and where you once were. It's a direct reference to Nduka's Nigerian background and points to a characteristic of his poetry that is, as Nduka calls it, beyond world literature. In this second episode, I ask Nduka to describe his approach to writing poetry, and he elaborates on adjectives he's used in the past, such as varied and elusive. Nduka also discusses the process, through his writing, of decolonizing language and knowledge, even as he strives to create a voice that speaks to his Nigerian background and a global audience. Nduka, I wanted to circle back to you and just generally have you describe your approach to your poetry. I mean, you've used adjectives and phrases such as varied, elusive, beyond world literature. I'm wondering if you could elaborate that on a little bit.
Yeah, I come to poetry from what it's said sometimes with some derision from an oral culture. My very first exposure to poetry was from my paternal grandma, to whom I write one of the poems here. My paternal grandma, and so that's one grandma's pipe. One of the poems in the collection. And so we were used to Tales by Moonlight, those days when there wasn't electricity in the sense of modern electricity, and a few people in the village would have electricity. And so you sit down and listen to tales from grandma, stories, most of them about the tortoise and so on and so forth. So I approached this, and then there were events. Almost every event had ceremonies of poetry, ceremonies of life from birth and so on. I come to my poetry from this background. And watching an oral performer, a professional oral performer on whom I did my master's thesis, Nweke Moma, a spectacular oral poet who performed, cross-dressed. And then he enjoyed hiding himself, as a woman amongst the audience and emerging from there spectacularly to perform. So I come from my poetry from this background. And this has shaped my ideas. So a lot of the poems that I have written begin, in some cases, conceptualized in my head between narrative and the immediate experience. And so that narrative voice is there from the first sequence. And it's also responsible for why some of the poems come in sequences. If you even see the new poems that I have operate within that kind of ambience of a sequence, working together. Even if not closely knit. In some cases, they are. And so, placed within the context of Western tradition, it becomes you have to start qualifying. And so, the way that I say it, is a certain kind of juxtaposition between what we call, modern poetry or oral poetry. And my research has been in oral literature. And I find this very innovating, very often trying to explain, how do you move poetry from one context, cultural context, to the other? What is missing? What is it that is unsaid? How do I need to explain?
I'm wary of that word, what is missing. I would want to rephrase that and say not what is missing, but what can that original bring to the new?
Yes,
Yeah, I caught on that also. So yeah, that would be.
It's not a deficit or a missing. It is an addition and an
I'm looking at it
enrichment.
in the context of the Western canon.
Yeah.
If you look at it in the context of the Western canon, and when we think about what literature has often thought about, there's a certain kind of fundamental word that puts in literatures from a global south most of the time, or from cultures outside of this. So it's like there is created an artificial opposition, and in contemporary times, we are world citizens in a sense, even if some people might contest that. But you find yourself moving across space, and in each of these, you are evolving. And so, how would you define Nduka Otuno's poetry, for example, as belonging to Canadian poetry? These are questions that we can also develop. However, within the global moment and within the discourses around diaspora and of migration and of refugees, we are seeing new mashes. We are seeing a conglomeration of different cultural experiences coming together. And so in my work, I enter into conversations with these various cultures, whether they are academic poetry. And so I engage in what I call intertextual references. So I am speaking to other poets and speaking to the world and speaking to other people. And in some cases, I'm also using their words and reinventing their words or reinterpreting it. In so doing, meaning becomes elusive in some cases, or it becomes challenging because in this case, as I had noted, I'm fortunate to have had an editor who has a background and can, relate to some of these contexts. For some other people, it becomes very frustrating. But I think in all, it is this kind of conversation, not just of being elusive, but of expansion, of expanding our knowledge of poetry, our knowledge of the world through migrations and like living in new contexts, as would happen when you have somebody whose natal home is Nigeria, relocating to Canada and making Canada another home.
So it's sounding like you're definitely placing a priority on advancing your culture into sort of the world stage of poetry, but also seeing opportunity and combining it with your language. You're combining your language and culture with sort of, I guess, Western notions of what poetry and then poetry's format can be.
That's correct.
Yeah.
There's also, and that also leads us again almost inevitably to the language question. How do you speak in a certain kind of language? What would be the ideal language? Poets have argued about thinking in one language and communicating in a different language that is a colonial language. And there have been debates around which is the best form. Should I write in my indigenous language or should I write in the Queen's English, which is a colonial language, an imperial language? All of these are the kind of conflicts, that we try to engage, not resolve, because I don't think it's easy to resolve them. It depends on one's location in this situation. And so, yes, it's that distinction between taking your original natal culture and understanding that you're entering into conversation with a global culture and a global language. And how do you negotiate your place in this context?
Okay. Peter, I'm curious to hear your perspective on that in sort of your editorial process as well.
Nduka's touched on this in already in his response in some ways, in that I find many of these terms problematic, like world literature, for instance, simply because they're so loaded. It's the same as global south, another term that Nduka has used here, or third world. And we very politely relegate the literatures in this way into a position that says, this is not our primary concern. Our perspective is a Western concern,
Mm-hmm.
and that is what is not in our canon. So we immediately, by labeling this literature world literature, rather than just saying it's literature, we've already set a standard of what is canonized, what is standard English, which we've also heard about here. But what about someone like, so we can then, from that perspective, talk about the foreignness of Amos Tutuola's palm wine drink it and the language in that book, for instance.
Yeah.
When in fact, this is simply English. It is the way English is spoken in Nigeria. This is so. I have problems with the term, but I'm interested in seeing how oral forms manifest in writing. And Nduka's again talked about this a lot, and particularly for me in relation to Nduka's work here is how our ancestors come to inhabit the space provided by text, because we for in a Western frame of mind, we have worked very hard since the age of reason to differentiate and separate between the metaphysical and the physical, and we compartmentalize. We talk about the separation of church and state, whereas very often spirituality and culture are still are really intermingled and so closely done. So we talk about faith as something separate outside, but that's not the way it works. So I'm interested into finding how our ancestors and those who dwell in a spiritual realm inhabit the texts that we produce in all shapes. So how do we, so in the introduction, I try and work with that material and come to the poetry from that angle to see how those cultural manifestations happen in the book. So there's a syncretism that is working here. Nduka talks about his heteroglossia, his engagement with other intellectual traditions, but he's not talking or hasn't mentioned the tremendous amount of interaction with African traditions and African conceptual frameworks that happens. I'm also very interested in, again, overturning certain concepts in literature. For instance, that it is the missionaries who brought literature to Africa. We think about this because the first book in African languages, beyond a secular book, is something like Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. But a book like the Kebra Nagast, The Glory of the Kings, predates Beowulf as a written text. We also think about Christianity as something imposed by missionaries, yet the Church of Ethiopia is one of the oldest existing churches. So we want to look from this world literature perspective as things that the West and the Western framework have brought to Africa, when in fact these things have been there. And so Nduka works in his poetry to highlight that. And in my introduction, I want to give readers an entry into that and say, go, look, this literature is way older than you have been led to believe. It is way richer, way more varied, and many of the philosophical traditions that you have now owned in the West have been shaped by African scholars.
Yes, and then I would like to add that, this makes me think about the whole idea of the logic of writing. How has writing helped in organizing the world, especially the movement from completely oral before writing in the traditional sense, and how this has helped organize the world and organize ideas. So embedded in this is also the whole idea of decolonization of knowledge. Many of us are trained in Western tradition. If you went to school, in fact, I went to school at the time, some of the experiences of indigenous peoples in Canada, I experienced it, in a sense, in a different way in Nigeria, where students were punished for speaking quote unquote vernacular in class. So you were told, and the class monitor will write names of students who spoke vernacular because you were being trained, to work in the civil service and English civil service. And in Nigeria, with its multiple languages, English is the lingua franca. English is the official language. And so within this context also is how, some of us intentionally or sometimes unintentionally struggle with the necessity of decolonizing language, of decolonizing knowledge, because our training is immersed in Western tradition. You think in terms of sonnets, probably, in a more organized form with a degree in English up to a PhD. And then you come and you start hearing terms like post-colonial literature, These are terms that are not African in its sense, but they are also loaded politically, as ways of subjugating different cultures to some imperial and central culture. So all those arguments about center and periphery that emanate from it, all of these are the back of my mind, and I think most African writers, that consciousness levels might vary, but there is the additional burden of saying, this is my tradition, this is my voice. I'm trying to crystallize a voice that both speaks to my own people, but also addresses a global audience. How do I negotiate? How do I manage to achieve that? And so in my poetry, I do that not only in terms of the themes that I walk through, not only in terms of the line arrangement, but also in the imagined accompaniment of musical instruments, most of which are African, the drums. Because in Africa, this poetry is associated with rites of passage. It's a living thing. When there's a naming ceremony, the drums. When there's funeral, there are drums and their songs and their poetry. Each of them have their own specific forms. Their panegyrics to praise a warlord or to praise a hero. Say as we have in the epic. All of these are associated, in the ways that one responds to them. And there's so much going on at every point in time. And I'm happy to have worked with Peter because this has also allowed us to make some of these poems come around completely, not completely, but new, having a different resonance, the original resonance from which I operated. At the time of some of the early poems, we couldn't achieve.
You just heard from Nduka Otonyo, an associate professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, and author of the recent collection of poetry called DisPlace, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Also joining us was Peter Midgley, the collection's editor and an independent scholar. This episode is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week for a conversation about the many avenues of thought that are opened up when considering the collection's title, DisPlace, and how being on sabbatical during COVID influenced the tone and themes of some of Nduka's poems.
Within the period, I didn't quite mean it that way, but I discovered that some of the poems I was writing again, the new poems were very, very sad. They had all of this recurrent theme of death, of transition. And there was nothing I could do about it. I didn't set out to write any unhappy poems, and I didn't have experience that was going to make me write any happy poems, as it were. And so it became some kind of catharsis. It became a process in which I was able to expel, to heal, to also free myself from the dread.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And as always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.